Hello, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual book talk series. Today's program features Sara Johnson and her book, Encyclopédie Noire, The Making of Moreau de Saint-Méry's Intellectual World, which was published last year by the University of North Carolina Press and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. The virtual book talk series features recent scholarship broadly related to book history, print culture, and material texts, and it is sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. Before we turn things over to the speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the American Antiquarian Society. AAS is situated on the ancestral homeland of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. AAS is both a research library and a learned society, and has been in Worcester since its founding in 1812. Our goal is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded always in our ever-growing collection of primary sources, which numbers approximately 4.5 million individual items. The collection spanned 4 centuries and include a variety of materials, such as Caribbean almanacs and newspapers, board games, lottery tickets, works printed for children and by children, dime novels, and much, much more. To learn more about AAS, please visit our website, americanantiquarian.org. My name is John Garcia, the Society's Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships, and I'm joined today behind the scenes by my colleague, Lauren Havelis. Throughout the program, Laura will be posting useful information into the chat, including instructions on how you can use the Q&A function later on in the program. Laura will also give us information on how you can purchase a copy of Sara Johnson's book, including a discount code from the publisher. As a reminder to all, today's program is being recorded, and it will be available soon on the AAS YouTube channel. We thank you for joining us. And as a nonprofit organization, we greatly appreciate any support you can give to help us with our mission. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Sara Johnson is a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego. Her teaching and research areas include the literature, history, and theory of the Hispanophone, Francophone, and Anglophone Caribbean. She also studies the age of revolutions in the extended Americas and music and dance traditions of the African diaspora. Her first book, The Fear of French Negroes, Transcolonial Collaboration in the Revolutionary Americas, is an interdisciplinary study that explores how the people of African descent responded to the transformation in colonial life in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. Professor Johnson, her research has been supported by many fellowships from institutions and organizations such as the Ford Foundation, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Bibliographical Society of America, and many more. Encyclopédie Noire has also been receiving numerous awards and accolades. And to name just a few, it has received the J. Russell Major Prize from the American Historical Association, the Boucher Book Prize from the French Colonial Historical Society, and it is currently a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Yale Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. The book is also a finalist for the Suzanne M. Glasscock Book Prize, and it's shortlisted for the Kenshaw Prize in 18th-century Studies. It's also just a beautifully executed book in the way that it looks and feels. And one of the many outstanding things about it is also features artwork that was produced by Sara Johnson in collaboration with the artist Lou Sandoval. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to today's speaker, Sara Johnson.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you today. Thank you, John, for that introduction. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today as part of this virtual book talk series. I've really enjoyed watching other presentations over the years, and I want to especially thank John for this invitation and for his support of the book, and Lauren Havelis for all of her help with this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I'm going to be showing lots of images, sharing lots of images with you today. Okay. So I thought I would start by introducing Moreau de Saint-Méry. You see him on the cover of the book. This is a portrait of him, one of many portraits of him. And it's a portrait, if you notice, actually, I chose this one for a few reasons. And one is you'll see the gilt-bound book on the side. When he was picturing himself and imagining himself, he always imagined himself as a bibliophile. He was very proud of his work as a collector of books. He had a career as a lawyer and an ethnographer, a printer, and a bookseller. He actually owned a French language bookshop while in exile in Philadelphia during the French Revolution. He was an editor and translator, a diplomat, and a participant in a host of intellectual academies in Europe and in the Americas. He's pretty much the primary source for anyone who's working on the French Caribbean and colonial Saint-Domingue specifically, the former colony that fought a war of independence to become what is now Haiti. But, you know, part of what the book argues is that Moreau's reach was so much greater than this because he was an archivist who amassed a huge book, map, and primary source collection that is the cornerstone of the French colonial archives. He wrote about China, Paraguay, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, the United States. In short, he was a polymath, and his research, as well as his work as a collector, provide a window into the wider transatlantic. And importantly for me, because I'm very interested in inter-American and inter-Caribbean circles as well. His work really delves into the specifics of how the early Americas communicated across colonial frontiers. So this slide right here shows just a few of his canonical publications, which number in the thousands of pages. Right here in the center, you see his Description topographique de la partie française de l'île de Saint-Domingue. It was kind of his most well-known book. It's a long description, 2 volumes, printed in Philadelphia, as you'll notice, about colonial Saint-Domingue. To the right, you see an excerpt from this book. It's one of the things he's most well known for. He created an elaborate table which tried to justify and explain the supposed 128 degrees between whiteness and blackness, right? He created a table and then a long prose narrative. It's really kind of an early eugenics model of the differences between races. And then here over on the left, you'll see just one volume of his multi-volume Laws and Constitutions, which was this kind of massive undertaking that he did to publish, you know, the laws of the larger French colonial empire. So these are the things that he's most well known for. My book is in fact centered on this canonical figure, but it comes at him from different angles. And I've written what I've called a communal biography. And what that means is that Moreau serves as the glue that binds the book together, but he acts as a very unreliable central figure whose interpretations I question throughout. So to the extent that the biographical genre works on behalf of an individual subject, communal biography extends a reader's focus to the lives of others. These others, so often lost or unknown, or known rather only through fragments of information, are critical interlocutors in this book. Communal biography concentrates attention on what and whom we know and do not know historically. It is a creative interdisciplinary exercise. And by creative, I think it's really important to say up front that the arguments of this book are also made via its format. Experimental writing modes enabled me to process the past differently, to query why this man who admitted that sometimes he could not even tell one Black person from another is still regularly cited as an authority on hemispheric slavery 200 years later. And so my experiment with communal biography functions through the accumulated weight of serialized anecdotes, both textual and graphic. Just as importantly, experiments with the way that words and images are presented, the way of crafting a page, as it were, so that readers have to ingest and process information differently than they ordinarily might. For example, the book makes meaning through upside-down text and chapters that are written as encyclopedia entries instead of traditional long-form prose. I convey my arguments through the juxtaposition of color images and 18th century design elements, such as book ornaments and type that I repurpose. I'm particularly interested in telling the stories of the enslaved who lived in Moreau's circles and the free people of color and the enslaved that he interviewed and wrote about to gain an international scholarly reputation. And again, he had a tremendous international scholarly reputation. He was well known on both sides of the Atlantic. He was born in Martinique, and he had a successful career in Saint-Domingue, and he strongly identified as a Creole, despite living for long periods of his life in Europe. As such, he believed that he could speak for the Americas, that he was an authority on the colonies. And this reputation absolutely depended on the extraction of labor, physical and intellectual labor as well, from people of African descent. So, despite his vast archives, however, my research involved a lot of detective work to find these people who were often anonymous, and they remained in his shadow. Ultimately, the project is a life-making endeavor, a pushback against slaves or even enslaved as the dominant category for studying people. Instead, people on these pages are encountered as language innovators, as members of kinship networks, as world travelers, as figures, often unwilling ones, in transatlantic scientific and moral debates, as brokers of their own social and political lives. This afternoon, I thought I'd divide my talk into two parts to give you a sense of the book. In the first part, I'm going to share several entries from this titular Encyclopédie noire that I created. This Black encyclopedia comprises the opening, middle chapter, and conclusion of the book. You can think about them as the spine, the book's spine, the place where ideas in this case are gathered. The chapters serve as the foundation that sets the book's stakes by prioritizing the people around Moreau who made his pursuit of knowledge possible. I will then share two experiments that involved visual storytelling in this non-traditional biographical project. So actually, just to go back to this one, I'm going to talk, I'll be sharing four entries. I'll be talking about four women and one man named Jean-Baptiste. And then again, I'll give you two examples. One is a listening puzzle, and one is a portrait of his household, two portraits of his household. So to create this household and the professional worlds that Moreau moved in, I had to work with hundreds of scattered fragments of information in multiple languages. And these fragments were gleaned from notarial records, journals, ship manifests, newspapers, and other primary sources such as rare books, including Moreau's own published and manuscript work. And these archival sources were located all over. I spent a lot of time in Paris and Aix-en-Provence at the Colonial Archives in France, various public archives and private archives in Italy, in Philadelphia at the Library Company, sort of where this project was born, actually, and the American Philosophical Society, and Providence, Rhode Island at the John Carter Brown Library, just to give you a few examples. If you look here, you'll see some of the manuscripts that I was looking at, some of the bound volumes. Again, these are some volumes that he bound himself. And I often pay a lot of attention when I had access to manuscripts, but also the published versions of things. I moved a lot between these different versions. The book itself is really interested. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me mention one other thing. The very bottom here, when you think about archival origins, you think about the text and the manuscripts. But I also want to say that I worked a lot with actual ornaments, book ornaments. So here are just two examples. There's some border ornaments. And then right in the center, I have this other example of this very graceful musical instrument. And I use these ornaments throughout the book. I reproduce the things that he actually used in his own text, but I use them for different purposes. So for example, this musical instrument, it always appears in the text as a signal that the analysis that I place it beside is going to be decidedly unmelodic, right? It's going to be often tasteful. The ornament itself actually serves as a mnemonic cue in the narrative to show the dissonance that, in Moreau's text, when he was really trying to make them as beautiful and pleasing to the eye as possible, at the same time, he was actually in the pages talking about these very discursively violent events. And I'm going to pause here just to give a shout out to the Omohundro Institute and UNC Press, who worked with me for more than a year, actually, in the production stage of this book. We're all gathered here together virtually on this call with the American Antiquarian Society because of our study of books and print culture. And there were many moments when I was finishing this book that I actually felt like I was in a print shop myself in the final stages of bringing this book into the world. For example, as we work to ensure that the Bodoni typeface in chapter 3, for example, chapter 3 is printed in a different type, looked different enough from the Garamond typeface that we use in other chapters as a way of mimicking Moreau's own print style. We did multiple sets of page proofs, what the press called rough pours at the end, to be sure that the design elements, appeared correctly in the book. So I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge all of the extra behind the scenes work that went into this final project. The first point that I would like for you to take away today is that Moreau sold people to buy books and books to buy people. Books and human beings circulated in related transactional circuits. He used print to secure his social and professional status in a transatlantic and inter-American knowledge market that was also a human labor market. We cannot separate his publications, including the sophisticated imprints he self-published, from slavery. And this slide just gives you a perfect example of that. This is an advertisement that appeared in June 1783 of the main newspaper in Saint-Domingue, the Affiche Américaine. And as you'll notice, he was about to return to France. It was an important moment in his life, and he was trying to gather funds. He needed the funds not just to return to France, but particularly to return to France so that he could pay for the printing of the next volume of his legal books, right? So again, books and people. He sold his prized encyclopedia, the 18th century compendium of Enlightenment thought you'll see here. He even noted the edition, right, that he was selling. At the same time he was selling the edition, he was also selling human beings, and not just any people. In this case, he was selling two men who cooked the family food, who styled their hair, people who are part of his domestic household circle. So sources like this advertisement really helped me to make this connection between slavery and print culture very clear. The fragments of information that I collected became entries in this encyclopedia. And here you'll have one example. This is from part 2 of the encyclopedia. Each part opens with a list of the entries, right? And today I'm going to highlight how women's stories, particularly these stories of intercolonial and transatlantic migration and loss, can be centered in accounts of the Age of Revolutions, think both the French and Haitian revolutions in this case, that are often accounts that are very male-dominated and told along nationalistic lines. The women that I have found, again, living in his world, they're moving between Louisiana, Paris, Saint-Domingue, into Italy, right? And it's always these little tiny fragments of information that I'll get that mention, in some cases, their names or what have you. And these examples relate, if you see them all piled in here together, to a second point that I want to make today. And it's one about my method for creating this communal biographical project. And that was that although I was working with scattered pieces of information, when the fragments became serialized, when I placed them together into these encyclopedias, they emerged as a collection of anecdotal narratives with their own logic as an ensemble. And again, your first entry you see is Jean and Sylvie here. I just have little glimpses of them in his journals, for example, right? But when I was looking at letters in Italy, I'll notice that Sylvie is still mentioned. So again, we have just little pieces of information and they appear in passing. But almost the joy of creating this encyclopedia was that by the time I put them all together, they acquire a weight and a presence, and you get a really different sense of, the people who are all around Moreau. The encyclopedia format, actually repurposing it, in my case, it really allowed me to place slavery at the heart of the French Enlightenment's literary genre par excellence. So I'm going to start with my first entry that I'll be sharing today. This is about Amenaïde, who is also known as the Contessa d'Alastre. Amenaïde was Moreau's beloved daughter, and she embodies the long-term intimate connections Moreau had with people of African descent. These words that you see here provide a glimpse into Moreau's most important, effective, and financial ties. The information comes from a legal transaction in which Moreau compensated Amenaïde's mother, a freed mixed-race woman named Marie-Louise Laplaine, for her work as his housekeeper for 5 years. Part of this compensation involved giving Amenaïde 2 enslaved women and money to purchase another woman. So why would Moreau bequeath such a large sum in human beings to his housekeeper's daughter? Amenaïde's baptismal record, dating from 1778, noted that the father was unknown. You'll see here in this slide, right? It's a père inconnu. He was an unknown father. In 1997, Michel Camus published a short research note suggesting that Moreau's generosity and the timing of Amenaïd's birth made it likely that she was Moreau's daughter. And over the years, I found so much corroborating evidence that confirms this conclusion. So, for example, a multi-year correspondence between Moreau, housed in the Italian State Archives in Parma, documents the close relationship between the two and provides many clues about their family lives. It's unclear where she passed the majority of her childhood, although in one letter, Moreau lamented leaving her in Paris upon a return trip to the Caribbean. A 1788 notarial transaction I found between Marie-Louise Leplaine and Moreau demonstrates that Amenaïde was living in France by the age of 10. By the time she was 15, she had fled with the Moreau family from France to the United States when Moreau became, persona non grata under Robespierre, and the family moved into Philadelphia. When they returned to Europe in 1798, Amenaïde accompanied them and subsequently moved with them to Parma, Italy in 1801, when Moreau effectively became the head of state working for Napoleon in the Duchy of Parma. Amenaïde married an Italian nobleman, the Pompeo d'Alasta, a marriage that would have increased the family's social capital in the city they had come to rule. And again, I want you to think about this, right? We have this woman in this certificate, born in Saint-Domingue, a mixed race woman, and she ends her life in Italy as a noblewoman, as a countess. Just to give you a sense of that, when I was in Parma, you can actually go to the cemetery, and I found her tombstone, right? This is just a picture of her memorial. And in the conclusion of the book, I use a photo of this monument to design an accompanying visual to show how this exalted memorial stone was in part made possible from the profits generated by Amenaïd's enslavement of others. I want to show you this image too. She received a certificate of merit from the Parma Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture in 1802 and became a well-known painter. This certificate, if you noticed, I've highlighted it here, right? It lists her surname as Moreau de Saint-Méry, demonstrating that Moreau's illegitimate, quote unquote, illegitimate natural-born quadroon daughter did in fact carry Moreau's family name by the time she was in her 20s. As president of the Academy, Moreau affixed his name as well. Again, finding the certificate, was one of those fun aha moments in the archives. Again, proof that she and Moreau had this kind of connection. Cher Amenaïde, dear Amenaïde. This is how so many of his letters to her start. She was his constant correspondent. When these letters are read alongside a personal journal that Moreau kept while in Italy, a representative account of their interactions emerges, and a sketch of the young woman Amenaïde takes shape. She was literate and a talented artist. When her husband turned out to be a philanderer, Moreau counseled her and wrote often about the concerns for her health. He was by her side when she went into labor, and he even named one of her children. He talks about all of this in these letters. For a man obsessively concerned with racial mixture and curtailing the rights of free people of color, Moreau's devoted relationship to this woman reveals the gap between public writings and private life. The person who had one of his closest long-term relationships with a mixed-race daughter is best remembered as the author of that elaborate table I showed you at the beginning, and all of his commentary concerning the alleged differences between white and Black people that claim the latter were inferior. He wrote and self-published these words about the importance of distinguishing people of even remote African descent from whites as an explicit caution against allowing them full economic and social privileges, at the same time that his daughter was playing the piano, one that he had shipped to her from France into Philadelphia, in the rooms above their bookstore in Philly, and while she worked side by side with their family doing manual labor in their print shop. So again, this whole portrait of her started to emerge, and I really wondered if Amenaïde would even have self-identified and been accepted as a woman of color, either in the United States or Europe. I wonder if she kept in touch with her birth mother, a formerly enslaved woman. While we do not have her letters, we actually do have this. So this is a small formal portrait she painted of her father. It's the one that graces the book's cover, albeit a little bit changed. And the one I opened with here, this is a portrait that she did, and it's now hanging in Parma's National Gallery. I don't know what you all think about this portrait. We can talk about later. Has some issues, right? But he looks almost pig-like in this photo, in this portrait to me. Okay. So I'm going to turn to another entry now, and this is an entry about a woman named Angélique. So when Amenaïde was an infant, she suckled at the breast of a woman named Angélique. If you read this phrase here, you'll see in 1783, this is Moreau writing, I freed a Black woman and her 2 children because she had nursed in 1778, a young female who owes me her life and for whom my deep tenderness is known. So if you notice in the original and the translation here, négresse, Black woman, she's an anonymous woman, right? He simply included her in 2 sentences and he never mentioned her name. However, in the French archives, there is a manumission paper. When I knew roughly when he had freed her, I went and tried to figure out, what notary might have done that transaction. I looked through lots of notarial books and was elated to find this particular entry, right? This is from, again, 1783. It's an act of liberté. And it identifies Angélique as a Black Creole woman around 30 years old. She was born in the Americas, perhaps in Saint-Domingue, and she was about the same age as Moreau. Angélique was the mother of 2 children, an 8-year-old daughter named Sophie, and an anonymous 4-month-old baby. These 2 children were manumitted alongside their mother. So when I'm trying to find then more information about Angélique, several investigative paths yield details of this woman's life. The first involves milk. Angélique worked as a wet nurse, and it is through this labor that traces of her life story can be discerned. In order for her to have been able to nurse Amenaïde, she must have been lactating, possibly after giving birth to her own child, months or even a few years before Amenaïde's birth. The manumission record makes no mention of a child close to Amenaïde's age. She would have been about 5 at the time. Had this child died? Had she or he been sold before 1783, or simply not included in Moreau's decision to emancipate Angélique and her other 2 children? The very presence of Angélique's milk and the subsequent textual absence of a 5- or 6-year-old child in 1783 hint of an undocumented story of loss. There is evidence, however, that Angélique nursed others after Amenaïde. Moreau wrote that she, I quote here, rendered the same service to the son of Don Bernardo de Galvez, who died as the Viceroy of Mexico. So again, Galvez, for whom Galveston, Texas is named, supported the Patriot cause during the American Revolution and lived in Cap Français in the early 1780s. Galvez benefited from the work of a lactating woman that Moreau enslaved. One of the many enslaved people whose labor cut across competing colonial regimes, in this case, the French and the Spanish, who were always, in competition in the Caribbean, Angélique was thus a Black woman who fed Moreau's daughter and Galvez's son. These 2 influential men, a French Creole functionary and a Spanish military officer, cemented their friendship through her milk. This deeply personal interaction is an example of what Lisa Lowe describes as the forced intimacies of many empires. I want to show you the verso side of this record as well, because while I was tracing the work of Angélique's work as a wet nurse, I also searched for a name that would allow Moreau's, again, Black woman to shed her anonymity. It was really satisfying to imagine her moving about the Moreau household inhabiting a moniker, Angélique, Angélique, Angélique. It's evocative to imagine not just any child, but a girl named Sophie and her infant brother interacting with their mother, or possibly Amenaïde. However, because the law required people of color to be given new surnames in some approximation of what they, called an African idiom upon their manumission, this knowledge is transient. At the moment when archival evidence changed them from anonymous people to Angélique and Sophie, they acquired the new names, and you'll see that right here, I've underlined. Angélique then becomes Mirza, Sophie becomes Zilia, right? The little boy becomes Azur. So the unstableness of naming as a practice and search technique is a literal reminder that, as literary critic Stephen Best puts it, in the archive of slavery, to be found is to remain undiscovered. Naming people, buying people, freeing people, being named and renamed, maimed, bought, and freed, advocating for one's freedom and that of one's children, having the children of others, some strangers, be entitled to one's breast. Angélique negotiated a world where these behaviors were quotidian. Now going to move on to Marguerite Rebecca, and I'm going to move away from Moreau's immediate family household to show how he interacted with other people of African descent and then circulated knowledge about them in his professional publications. So Marguerite Rebecca, Moreau writes of her, I want to speak of albinos, or white blacks as they are called in the colony. Marguerite Rebecca, born in 1767, is sweet and hardworking. She reads, writes, I have saved some of her writing, does calculations well, and has in her speech and her countenance the assurance of a person of her status. She sews beautifully. I have worn shirts made by her, and she is gay and sometimes and seems to be different from other blacks only due to her physical features. Her skin, animated by the great heat, also blushes due to the embarrassment she experiences when she is observed. Her hair is a kind of curly wool, agreeable enough when touched. So Marguerite Rebecca was a 16-year-old Black albino woman. Interviewing her in 1783, Moreau documented that she could read, write, cipher, and sew. What did Marguerite like to read, and to what use did she put her ability to do mathematics? What things did she write about, and for what reason might Moreau have kept her handwriting? This detailed discussion of her skin, eyes, stature, and supposedly gay personality also included observations about the hair on her head. He was sure to mention that her eyebrows, pubic, and armpit hair were of the same texture and color, in addition to providing the information that she had recently started menstruating and survived both smallpox and measles. Moreau's scientific inquiries required having complete access to Marguerite and united his reading knowledge of albinism with empirical knowledge gained by touch, sight, and sound. The intimacy of wearing her handiwork, touching her hair, reading her writing, and being close enough to see her blush, that part always makes me cringe, and being close enough to see her blush when examined is indicative of how Moreau studied Black bodies, often at close quarters, as a means of advancing his intellectual career. He used this information, as you'll see here, in multiple publications as a way of advancing his intellectual career. These are two publications that circulated internationally. You'll see right here in the center, he actually in 1801 translated a very important work done by Félix de Sara on Paraguay. It was, he did quite a bit of work on birds, on quadrupeds, and before he was even able to publish these accounts in Spanish, Moreau got these manuscripts from Asada's brother and published them in French first. And in that particular case, he uses a paratext to start arguing with the author and saying, oh, no, I know this woman. He has a whole story about Marguerite Rebecca in this text. And she also appears in this Description de la Partie Française as well. So again, Marguerite becomes part of these scientific circles, right? And I want to just say it's really clear to me that these examinations that he did of Marguerite and others brought him pleasure. The details about his interactions with Marguerite are saturated in prurience, and one does not have to look hard to see this side of Moreau in his fellow colonists' works. Allusion to the sexualized nature of labor of enslaved women, free women of color, and even white women to some extent is a through line in Moreau's anecdotes, whether discussing issues such as prostitution or what he calls love, right? And marriage in Spanish Santo Domingo, Philadelphia, Cap Français, or Italy. I'm going to move to my last example here that's drawn from the Encyclopedia. I'll read it first. A Black man named Jean-Baptiste, hating agricultural work and wanting to get out of it, conceives of cutting using the dimensions of his right arm, an arm of fairly hard wood, and for several months he used his left hand to cut the wrist of his wooden arm with his sickle. When he finally had confidence in his cut, he put his true right hand in place, but could not amputate it before the fourth blow. So Jean-Baptiste thus entered the historical record when Moreau used him as an example of how the enslaved allegedly felt about their circumstances. His story appears as a brief anecdote mobilized to explain how the enslaved supposedly experienced chagrin, were able to endure physical pain, and how they had been known to hurt themselves, and he quotes, to quote him, for frivolous motives. Moreau felt qualified to assess Jean-Baptiste's thoughts, relating this tale for its evidentiary value about the interior life of the enslaved. But the tale itself is pretty striking. Jean-Baptiste's resourcefulness and sheer desperation are both palpable. In an age of enlightenment that prized empiricism and ingenuity, all of Jean-Baptiste's inventiveness and experimentation were put to destructive rather than creative use. He used his resourcefulness to create a wooden arm extension, a prosthetic, so that through a process of trial and error, he could determine how to effectively maim himself. And I want to mention here that prosthetic use among the enslaved was not unheard of. One contemporary observer even noted that a colonist in Saint-Domingue was nicknamed Master Wooden Legs. In French, it's Maître à Jambes de Bois, right? By the people forced to work on his behalf because of his habit of cutting off their legs below the knees. As a price for their perceived disobedience, he replaced their limbs with wooden peg legs. So back to Jean-Baptiste, although Moreau was interested enough to note that it took 4 hacks for Jean-Baptiste to sever his hand, there's no indication that he recognized or empathized with the terror that must have accompanied that bloody scene. There's no indication that he shared the repulsion with which we might respond to his words. A reader is not even told if Jean-Baptiste survived. If he did, we could not trust Moreau's gloss on what Jean-Baptiste might have been thinking at that moment when he made such a life-changing decision. Moreau did not experience the functioning of the institutions that enabled slavery in the abstract. He knew all about these tortures and abuses, including those that the enslaved inflicted upon themselves. He saw severed heads placed on pikes as warnings. He smelled burning flesh. He heard screams. Yet his scholarly voice is casual about violence and the desperation of his fellow human beings. He had a propensity to discuss extreme abuse in cheerful, anecdotal, yet detached in an inhumane way. Although this lack of empathy was conditioned by his upbringing around such cruelties, it was not the only intellectual or moral path available to him. I often hear, oh, but he was a man of his times. No, his affective dissonance is particularly remarkable when his discussion of frivolousness is based on examples of dismemberment and a system in which self-motivation became a viable life and death choice for people. Autonomy, authority, newness, indifference, absolute power. Toni Morrison suggests that meditations on these matters were indelibly linked to the development of U.S. literature. They are equally resonant in the elaboration of Caribbean cultural production, particularly the body of planter literature produced by Moreau and his contemporaries. And here I'm thinking about memoirs, how-to manuals, political tracts, natural histories. This urge towards domination is embedded adjectivally in Moreau's prose that I examined throughout the book. For example, as he discusses Ivo's stories of flying back to Africa, a man who willingly castrated himself in order to escape the scourge of venereal disease. Headless, suicidal, one-armed, castrated, these are some of the adjectives I encountered. But the resulting contestation over absolute power and authority is likewise evident adjectively in how we can see the enslaved through their actions. One-armed, suicidal. I often encountered words like cantankerous, argumentative. These are words he also uses to describe them. Okay, I am now going to move to part 2 of the talk, which is entitled Illustrative Storytelling. And the examples that I'm going to share now serve as another narrative layer in the book, and they're graphic companions really to the textual prose that's found in entries such as the Encyclopédie noire, and more traditional chapters on the material dimensions of print culture, translation, and so forth. This brings me to a third takeaway today that I'd like you to keep, again, about method and how I created my communal biography. Just as we might apply theory to a body of work, I often use the visual as theory, and the graphics in the book work as interconnected vignettes, short-form narrative that frames how Moreau and his work become the object through which I see the subject of slavery. It's deep penetration into the lives of both individual people and larger institutions. And again, I want us all to remember that Moreau's work allowed for the creation of physical archives, right? It's the cornerstone of the French colonial collection. His legal work helped to stabilize colonial jurisprudence. The expense of illustrating and printing his books was literally covered by some selling members of his household. I created my own images and collaborated with an artist named Luz Sandoval to advance my line of argumentation graphically through manipulation of 18th century iconography and print ornaments, figurative drawing based on the historical record, attention to typography on the page. For the rest of my time, I'm going to give you a couple short examples, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we open up the discussion. So right now, again, if we're thinking about fragments, the fragments I was working with in the encyclopedia, I spent a lot of time tracking down information about the people connected to Moreau's household. So Louis, a Congo man, was one such person. This is an advertisement, in an effort to recapture him. I knew him as soon as I saw this. I was very excited because I knew that he was going to be a critical interlocutor when assessing another piece of evidence that I had been working on about slavery in Saint-Domingue. Louis was actually owned by Baudry de Lauzière, who was Moreau's brother-in-law, lifelong friend, and close companion while they lived in Saint-Domingue, in Philadelphia, in Paris, and Italy. This is the source that I was working on. This is just a copy of the manuscript title page that's in Paris, but this is actually a sample page too. And if you'll notice, it's a bilingual Kikongo French vocabulaire. It was developed by Baudry, who owned a coffee plantation, as a way of communicating with enslaved people. So the entries, they're alphabetical, and you'll see here certain words, right? You've got the French, and then you've got the Kikongo, but you also have phrases, right? So it's almost like a Berlitz phrase book. Like, these are the things that a planter needs to know. Up here, I am angry. Your mother gave birth to a pig. You are a poisoner. These are the kinds of phrases that are in this book. I'm going to give you another example that just breaks down some of these other phrases, okay? And when I worked on this text, I was so curious about how it might have actually worked in real life, not just on the page, but how in the world would people interact with phrases like this, right? I wanted to know how it might have been received by its intended audience, people like Louis. In order to demonstrate what this might have been like for my readers, I created a listening puzzle to foreground the interiority of enslaved people as they listened to some crazy version of Kikongo shouted at them or whispered to them. Look at some of these phrases. Your milk is good. You are a poisoner. Do you love me? Right? Again, these were actual phrases that Baudry imagined being useful and helping people to run a plantation more efficiently. But it's really important to say he also thought of himself as a benefactor, that this was a kindness, an act of kindness to talk to the enslaved in their own languages. Again, when you find advertisements like the one of Louis, I also mentioned two other ones in the book that show people that are running away from Baudry. He clearly was not, a benefactor to any of these people. So let me show you the slide puzzle, the listening puzzle. It occurs over several pages in the book, right? And the graphics are meant to recapture the bewilderment of the sonic worlds of violence and unfamiliarity that people who are coming from all over the world and coming into Saint-Domingue would have felt, right? Incomprehension and meaning vie with each other, much as creating understanding in a world of incomprehension was a vital intellectual and effective task for the enslaved people intent on survival. In the puzzle, I attempted to recreate the act of listening for readers, converting what one might have heard into that which is seen and must be decoded as written signs. Sound is visualized. In the act of reading the puzzle, the eye jumps, searching for meaning, perhaps impatient, caring only for the words that are recognizable. I wrote it to be wrestled with aloud, to capture baffling speech, as writing is an attempt to make the occluded inner functioning of the mind discernible. Outright confusion, gradual recognition, a refusal to engage. Each signals the perception, sentiment, and intentionality of the people hearing these words spoken by their captors. I notated what would be long and short vowel sounds in English with the consonant blends that simulate those found in attempts to notate 18th century Kikongos and the sounds of French. And even though this, was just a few pages in the book, it was actually one of the hardest parts of the book to write. I'm going to end now with this portrait of his household. I work with portraiture quite a bit in this book. And this is a particular one that was a drawing of the Moreaus, him and his wife among their workers. Each person pictured is documented in archival records, and I tried to be attentive to material culture, the brightness of the white linen head wraps, the blueness of clothing materials meant to signal servitude. After searching for these individuals for many years, assembling dramatized depictions of them, not only textually, but visually, allowed a communal biography to emerge in one frame. The household is alive and crowded with competing emotions, desires, and intentions. I wondered about these people's knowledge of lives lived in Louisiana, experiences of the Parisian capital, their native tongue thoughts in the language of Senegal or in Creole. I am interested in their relationships with each other as much as with their owners. Conversations Martin, you see she's right here in the center, number 3. Martin, I found glimpses and fragments about her all over the place, right? I'm interested in the conversations that Martin might have had with Angelique as they cared for Black and white children together. The joke shared, or perhaps competition felt, between Moreau's valet, he's number 1, and his hairdresser. Again, figure number 1, his valet. He's an entry in the Encyclopédie. He's only known as the domestique. I looked all over for this man trying to get more information about him. Moreau only says that he worked with him for 16 years. He didn't want to be freed, that, he loved Moreau more than anything in the world. Of course, that beggars belief a little bit, right? But I never, ever was able to find a name. But he appears here in this picture. I'm interested in knowing if the laundress and the cook, number 5 and 4, know that they will shortly be sold off. Again, many of these people have their own entries in the encyclopedia, and their faces are deliberately turned aside or rendered without detailed features, since we cannot know how they looked. Angelique and the children are the exception. They present an opportunity, an invitation almost, to consider the fullness of personalities in community, an invitation that suspends the need to claim historical accuracy. I then redid this image in the conclusion of the book when in the last encyclopedia entries, when I talk about Moreau's ouvrage, and particularly the encyclopedia ends with the letter P for poison, right? As we think about the poison of Moreau's intellectual legacy. And it's a reminder, this particular image, of all the arms that appear in the book's pages. The enslaved man named Jean-Baptiste, who chose to sever his arm, the arms that soothed Moreau's children, the arms that cared for the animals. You'll see a little monkey in here. There's a pretty prominent monkey story in the translation chapter on natural history. His household, depicted as a collection of dismembered arms, shows how these arms transform this space into a home, an organized library, a private scientific menagerie, profit. The pineapple, floating midair near the center of the room, concretizes whose labor was actually creating the vaunted hospitality that Moreau extolled as a cornerstone of Creole life. This image allows for discussion of how living people could be legalized as valuable objects, civilly dead, although Moreau knew objectively and viscerally that they were not. They could exist without feelings for kin that approximated his own, even though he knew that this was not true. They could exist as parts of themselves, the parts that cooked, built things, or existed as cash assets. In short, they could be arms, severed from rational feeling selves connected to whole bodies. The effect is intentionally horrific, creepy, exposing the lie that a person could ever exist solely as labor. In the course of conversations with fellow scholars over the years about how slave-holding activities of prominent public figures often go unremarked, I have more than once been told some version of, oh, it's not that surprising, everybody did this. And I've deliberated about how to make the lamented prevalence of such activity understandable in concrete and intimate ways to make what has come to be understood as the historically normal and ordinary practices of enslavement clearly resonate as abnormal, sadistic, as extraordinary. And one way to do this has been to directly link Moreau's immersion in print culture, his books and publications, to people, and importantly, people of African descent, to return to the refrain, people, books, books, people. They moved in the same circuits, sometimes within the same transaction, on board the same ships, within the same household. I'll close by saying that spending close to a decade researching this book was a pretty distasteful experience at times, right? Because there's only so much plantar virulence one can take. But the way I was able to write this book demanded that I be creative, that I try to tell stories in different ways. And I chose to turn to the visual and experimentation in form and format because it was truly the only way to write this book. I'll close leaving you with this last set of images that I repurposed. On the right, his canonical, idealized, and sexualized iconography of the supposed idyllic life of Black people in the colonies. To the left, his portraits of himself over the years. I gathered them all and I placed them in the same frame that you see in this portrait on the right? And I made this collage of his portraits to show how he self-presented as a respected statesman and intellectual. In this collage of his portraits, then, colorizing and stacking them is meant to turn the observer into the observed, to turn the racialized white subject into the racialized white object, to objectify Moreau as an ideologue of white supremacy, as he objectified free people of color and the enslaved in his fanciful portraits. The middle image is a negative rendition of the collage and signifies an incisive kind of X-ray-like underbelly, right? You can see his eyes glowing here. He's a predator, he's a vampire. It's a way of suggesting the violence, unrighteousness, in fact, how the opulence that some people were able to enjoy was really made possible by the extreme deprivation of many. Communal biography, then, its graphic, multilingual, experimental modes, has allowed me to explore Moreau's legacy by re-archiving it to different ends that rebut the worst of the plantar inheritance that he and other intellectuals have bequeathed us. It shows how Moreau's capacity to create and institutionalize knowledge, including knowledge about himself as a man who believed in his own biographical worthiness, was dependent on stolen labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. That was fantastic. I do want to just remind the audience that we have now reached the Q&A portion of the program. So please make sure that you put your questions into the Q&A part on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll give the audience just a minute to think over things a little bit. I mean, there's so much going on. This is such a rich project. And just to start things off, I just want to ask maybe a kind of big picture question about how your work in print culture, book history might be relevant or inspiring for other people working on the Caribbean. It's when somebody reads the book, you see so many different ways that you approach Moreau's life, right? As you mentioned, ornaments, typefaces, bindings, bookstores, print shop labor. You could go on and on. And so I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about how did you get to this approach, and where do you think it could lead for other people who are also working in different languages and different regions that relate to the Caribbean?
That's a great question. I should say that my interest in print culture first really involved when I started touching these sources and holding these sources and working with the original items. And that happened at the library company. I was actually working on my first book then, and I got a chance to spend a lot of time in Moreau's, with some of the few extant copies of his work. Jim Green was amazing. A shout out to Jim Green, right? Because he allowed me to go to kind of sit in the conference room with all of these books together. And, it really allowed me to immerse myself in his life as a printer. And it became really apparent to me at that point, again, I was working on a different book, but that I had enough, just thinking about the materiality of his productions, I had enough for a whole book. And then, of course, my last book really was pretty far reaching. It was about Jamaica and Cuba and Saint Domingue and all these different places. And I thought, no, I'm going to write a book about him that's not really about him. But of course, then it just blossomed out in all of these different directions, including China and Paraguay and all these places. But the print culture piece of it was so important to me because Moreau wasn't always, it's not just that we should be reading the content of his book, right? It's that, it's not just the words that mattered. It's all of the material conditions that allowed his books to be printed. There's a moment in the text where I talk about a couple of bibliographers who really, they scorn the people who are just mere readers of books as opposed to people who collected books and understood and loved books, right? Moreau was one of those people, and he echoed some of those thoughts. And he was really interested in the hands that produced the books. And so for me, this metaphor of the hands that were producing this material was really helpful as I, again, tried to write a communal biography, in some cases that literally emerged from the page by looking at ornaments, by looking at who was composing things for his press. But it was kind of a metaphor to look at other ways that I could be really attentive to the people around him and other intellectuals. I think this is something that absolutely is true for print culture around the Caribbean. If you think about how much use people have made, for example, out of runaway and for sale advertisements for enslaved people, right? There's a whole body of print culture that allows us to read against the grain and figure out what were the stories of these actual people? Why were they running away? So yeah, the materiality of the book, of Moreau's productions, of the productions of all of other people that I was reading, that he collected, again, a lot of these are in the French archives. It was really key for me when I was centering how I could go about this book. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it does. It was a way for me to really critique planter ideology, because we take so many of these primary sources for granted. If he says X, Y, and Z, you'll see those same claims repeated even in contemporary scholarship. And I really wanted us to say, no, why are we believing what this man says,
And as you mentioned, also the visual too, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
talk about the engravings that Moreau also included in his books as well.
Yeah.
There's we have just people that are they seem to just be blown away. We have a bravo, we have a stunning comment. So Lisa wants to know, I think, a little bit more about languages, and she wants to know what languages do you read and speak in. But I guess maybe it could also be turned into a bigger question about the project, the different language skills that you needed to do this research, right? I mean, he writes in French, but you look at other materials as well. Could you say more about how language works in the book?
Sure, that's a great question. I'm a language nerd, right? So, Moreau, I think this is actually part of what attracted to me this project, that attracted me to his work. I mentioned in the beginning that he worked on the Inter-Americas. He didn't just work on colonial Saint-Domingue. And although we study him in like this French national or colonial French history tradition, he really was working on all these things. So I was so excited when I finally located, for example, his manuscript on Puerto Rico, right? He did this translation. I have the manuscript. I see all of his notes in the side, right? Where he's comparing musical instruments in Puerto Rico with what's happening in Saint-Domingue, right? So he wrote in Spanish, he was reading English, he worked in French, he worked in Creole, he was a native Creole speaker. It was really important to me in this book, though, to emphasize that most of the people, there's a note on translation actually at the very beginning of the book. And it was really important for me that even though this book, in his words, prioritized the French, I made sure that the French was always in the actual body of the text, because it was a constant reminder to readers, like, this is not an English functioning world, right? It was not even really a French speaking world in many cases, which is why there's a whole chapter, for example, on Kikongo language sources, right? I don't speak Kikongo from the 18th century, so I had to go through French to get to the Kikongo. But if you think about a place like Saint-Domingue, that on the eve of the revolution, 2/3 of the population are from West Central Africa, they're not speaking French, and they might not even be speaking Creole yet, right? So if we want to study one of the most important events of the modern world, like the Haitian Revolution, we should be learning the languages that people were speaking, right? So the book is, it's an invitation really to learn these other languages that are in fact American languages, that are not European languages, and how we work with them. There's a whole chapter here about Paraguay, and Moreau did this whole pronunciation guide of Guarani, for example, the indigenous language Guarani, that's still spoken in Paraguay, Bolivia, and what have you. And it was really important to me to show that. So every chance I got, I tried to make it very clear that Moreau recognized the importance of languages that were not European ones, right? And that I think it's a way for us to think as modern day scholars about, again, a lot of us work in language departments, and all these languages, these places where language funding is not happening. It's really an invitation for us to think about how we train future generations of scholars, hopefully to have them work in some of these other languages that really get abandoned. So to answer your question, he worked in about 9 different languages, and I had to try to follow him through.
We have a question here that goes more to the research process. This is from Lauren Stafford, and she just asks, what was the process like for you? And you mentioned public and private collections. Did you find one to be more helpful than another, I guess, in the public versus private category?
That's a great question. The private archive is the Biblioteca Palatina, which is in Parma, and that's where I found a lot of the letters between Moreau. Moreau worked with a printer. This is something that's also really important, because we don't talk, I think, enough about the French and how important the French and the Haitian revolutions were to the evolution of print culture in Philadelphia, right? So when he opened this bookstore, not only did he have this multilingual bookstore, but he had all these refugees from both revolutions working there to, again, to set his type, to help him make these beautifully crafted imprints. And so when this is an interest that was born earlier than Philadelphia, but Philadelphia is really when it exploded, because, all of a sudden he had to live a different kind of life because he was in exile. But he carries that back into Europe when he returns. And he works with, for example, this Italian printer named Bodoni. So there's a private library in Italy that has a lot of that correspondence between Bodoni and Moreau and Moreau's son. It was actually really interesting to read that. I spent a lot of time going through Italian newspapers trying to figure out, like, did Amenaïj still show up? I found like this one little fragment that she exhibited 5 different portraits in Parma at one point, right? So I was trying to, again, figure out, what happened to all of these different people. And so public archives, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France was like amazing. Their French colonial collection in Aix is just... there's so much there, right? And the Moreau's collection specifically, I mean, you could write 1 million books using just his collection alone. There are 287 folios, and when you open them, some of them just have one book, like a translation, for example, of a really important Dominican piece, or some of them have actual depositions. You can see that he was stealing papers, that he was copying papers. You think, how in the world is this in there? They're newspapers. So it was kind of like this adventure that kept evolving. So I'd say that was probably one of the most important archives. And then again, the John Carter Brown and the Library Company of Philadelphia that have some of the few extant copies of some of these texts, including this Affiche Américaine set of newspapers. And, some of these newspapers, for example, that we all use if we want to study colonial Saint-Domingue, like the only full run of them, it's because Moreau saved them, right? And then they got bought by the King of France and incorporated into the French archives.
Also, or just as a side note, we have these kinds of things at the American Antiquarian Society as well. So we hope that you come, Sarah, to look at them too.
Absolutely.
Did you say?
I've been wanting to come for years.
Open invitation anytime. Could you just say a little bit more, just to follow up on that, about Moreau's library? And it's something that I was just curious about. What did you find when you were looking at his? I mean, you mentioned his manuscripts, but his collection, is it spread out? Did you find a bunch in one place? And what did you find in them?
So his library, it's so interesting. He has his manuscripts in like these 287 boxes, right? But then he also had his own library. So that library means, so this is where newspapers, pamphlets that were published, he collected everything, right? And so in France, they had that categorized under a whole separate series. And you can go and you can find novels, again, pamphlets. There's so many planter screeds. This is when I say this book was difficult to write sometimes. But I cannot spend another moment steeped in kind of this violence and grossness of, people are like, oh, let's just go back to, we're going to get Saint-Domingue back. This is after the Haitian Revolution, all these pamphlets he was collecting. All we have to do is go and like kill everybody who's there and we can start anew. This is literally the kind of genocidal information that they're spewing, right? And so, his library contains a lot of that information. Maps, I didn't even talk about the maps. There's a whole huge map collection in France. Again, part of his personal collection that's now available for consultation. So that's what his library looked like. But I guess I should say one last thing. When he died, there was a book sale, and that document was really helpful to me. They have a catalog of all the books that were for sale. And that was really helpful for me when I was doing this work, because I was interested in what he was reading and what he was collecting. Some of these works that, were sold are not things that ended up in the French archives, for example. And there's so much on printing, right? So it was really clear to me, for example, that, after he worked as a printer, he continued this relationship with Bodoni in Italy. He was still reading tons of books about the printing trade, right? He owned a lot of these books. And so again, that was really helpful for me as I was trying to think about why, printing was so important in his own work.
And that's really a great way to end. It really shows the way your research makes connections, right? Not just between his intellectual life, but his role as a printer and the implications of that for just so many different fields, right? And it's really impressive. You work with images, you work with not just in your writing, but in the presentation. It really is fantastic. We do have a late-breaking question, so we do have time for one more, if you don't mind.
Okay, of course.
So,
thank you all for these great questions.
We do have a current fellow, Jeanette Zaragoza asks here, she says, thank you, amazing work, multi-layered and multifaceted. It speaks also through how it feels to touch and to read these materials. Particularly appreciate the emphasis on translation matters, and this researcher who's here at AES is working on translation as well, and she's curious about Moreau's translation work. Is it comparing music between Puerto Rico and Saint-Domingue? So she researches this as well. Now, I guess she wants to ask. I guess maybe you can say a little bit more about at the end of the program about translation and the different ways that you saw him as a translator.
Sure. So this is one of the things, again, it gets talked about almost, not at all when you talk about Moreau. He was an amazing translator. The two things that I really talk about in this book, he worked in Dutch, right? So he did a translation of a Dutch book about a trip to China. It was a very important publication about one of the first Europeans who actually goes to the Forbidden Palace, right? And meets with the emperor in China. And this man resettled in Philadelphia. And so there's a whole chapter about print culture there. And so he was translating between Dutch and French, right? But also Chinese. So like there are moments when they're like little blanks in the manuscript and you can tell he wanted to insert a Chinese character, but he didn't have it. He didn't have that type, right? He gets it with Bodoni later. But the Puerto Rico part of it, the Puerto Rico and Paraguay parts of it, particularly his work in Spanish, he worked a lot in Spanish. One of the things I asked in the book is like, where did he learn Spanish? Who was he practicing with? He lived in Saint-Domingue for a long time. And if you look at any of even the newspapers there, you'll often see enslaved people who are moving back and forth. So it's very possible that he had people within his household who were Spanish speakers. He was practicing somehow. The particular translation he did was of Abad y la Sierra's book, like canonical book on Puerto Rico, right, from the conquest up until the 18th century. I found, I was imagining these two as like spirits. They were really interested in all of the different islands, particularly the Leeward, the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean, but also Puerto Rico, Cuba. They were interested in comparing this. And this manuscript actually is dated right around the time where the French are helping the Spanish fight off invasion of Puerto Rico. I mentioned music because that's one piece that I pull out in this manuscript, which again was never published. But the French Ministry of Defense, actually, the castle in Vincennes has a copy of this manuscript. It was really just interesting to me because in previous moments, I've written a lot about musical traditions that are traveling between Puerto Rico, Cuba, Saint-Domingue, and Trinidad, actually, as a result of the Haitian Revolution. So it was really interesting for me to think about how Moreau was positioning himself. He was like, we don't know much about Puerto Rico. We should know much more about Puerto Rico. I'm going to do this translation. This is what he says. And again, one piece that he really hones in on is the similarities in dance and cultural elements between Puerto Rico and Martinique and of course, Saint-Domingue. I'm happy to talk about that later. I know we're running out of time.
And we can always put you in touch too with
Yes,
with this particular fellow. So, well, great. Thank you, Sara. Unfortunately, we do have to close. But before we do end, I just want to mention a few remaining programs. We have 2 more programs for 2024. So we hope that that those in the audience will check them out. So next week on November 26th, we will have a virtual program just like this. It'll be at 7 p.m. and it will be with Camille Owens, and she'll be presenting on her new book, Like Children, Black Prodigy and the Measure of the Human in America. And that was partially researched here at AAS. That's virtual on November 26th at 7 p.m. And then our final program of the year is going to be with historian Seth Rockman. And this is going to be on December 3rd. He'll speak about plantation goods, a material history of American slavery. And that will be a hybrid program, so you can come to Antiquarian Hall and see it in person, or you can also tune in through Zoom as well. And that will be on December 3rd at 7 p.m. Please visit the website to find out information about all the programs we have for next year. There are already many things already online that we would love for you to check out in 2025. And when you go to the website, you can also find information on how to register. So thank you once again, Sara. This has been fantastic. And I just want everybody to have a great evening and a good holiday season. So take care.